walk down through the building and see it afterwards. And Darrin Fryer is going to be our first speaker, and Tyler Gibbs, and Alan Goldich, and Ben Grush. So our first speaker tonight is Darrin Fryer. He's one of Sotheby's International Realty's top performing brokers and has been working in real estate in Steamboat Springs for more than 13 years. He leads the Fryer team, which has achieved the company's top selling position for 3 years from 2012 to 2014, and he was a Best of the Boat winner too. He's an advisor for a number of successful real estate projects, including single-family home and other developments. And the reason why we've asked him here tonight is he's working with a tiny home builder in La Junta to do some research, and we'll let him go first.
Okay. Thank you. This is open. This is the introduction, a little bit of humour from our marketing department.
Sorry, can you talk up?
So that introduction there's a little bit of humour from our marketing department. We could have bought a bigger font, but it was appropriate. So thank you, marketing department. My name is Darrin Fryer from Steamboat Springs International Realty. I'm going to be obviously presenting a whole different perspective to these guys. It's going to be something from the point of view that I get a lot of people that talk to me, a lot of people looking for homes, upsizing, downsizing, and you just hear so much stuff. And I have to admit, I've never bought or sold a tiny home, never lived in one. Maybe because we don't have any here, or we have maybe very few. And so it's something that listening to the conversation of people, whether it's their shows or it's just a movement of some kind, people keep asking about them. And there's the fundamentals that they come down to that I've sort of distilled and listened to. So I'm going to try to share a perspective of really how difficult it is, because you can't just go and put a tiny home down really easily. And through the research I've done with a company that's asked me to kind of work with them and see what we can do here, they've successfully done it in other counties, other towns. And it's not an easy process because they're just not something that hasn't been zoned for. And it's a new thought process. It's going to involve a lot of innovation. So personally, I'd love to see it come to fruition. I have to be at the coalface of dealing with some young people who get to a point where they can't afford the rent anymore, and they move to Hayden or they move out of town. And I see other people that the kids move out and they decide they want to downsize, but there's nothing to downsize. It feels like home to them. It's just a condo. So I personally believe there's a market for it, and it's hard to say that there is because we haven't got it, but it's one of those things that's happening in other places, so it's obviously very real. We just haven't managed to get our head around it here and get it organised. So I'm going to be speaking on perspective, not just ones or twos. It's more like a bigger solution of like how can we get 100, 200, 50 or so. Ones or twos we can definitely make happen. There's little nooks and crannies, but it's not going to solve much. That process is going to be very slow. So I'm going to just show you the original tiny home. Hopefully this works. There you go. So that was the one that was here back 400 years ago. They could obviously pack theirs up in the back of the horse and move it wherever they wanted. And that's kind of where the tiny home movement started. People could move the house like nomads, could be freelancing. And that's got a lot to do with the movement, people's ability to really be agile. But realistically, well, there you go. Tiny homes come in all shapes and sizes. There's no rule, but it's around about 200 to 600 square feet. Some people say 500 for the cut-off. You can have a perspective on that. There's no law to it. It's small, okay, it's really small. But East Coast style, you've got super modern rustic. You can do anything you want, and you'll see a couple of photos and some other ones here. But they're all kind of cool looking, that's one thing that they are. So why do people live in them? These are some of the factors that I just looked on the internet to see what they're saying. Most of the people are building a little tiny home in a super cheap $5,000 lot in the middle of nowhere and building themselves. Then they've literally got no payment. They're living low cost. They've got a super light footprint. It's a sustainable situation. They can travel. But that's not something that solves the solution for a town. It's the sort of thing that you can do which is really fun idea, but not something that you can do at a bigger scale. So living simply is one of the biggest things. Independence. People really like the fact that when they build a tiny home, there's really low cost involved. They can be anywhere they want. They can travel. They can come back to where they want. Also, no shared walls. And a lot of people, they're not governed by HOAs and all sorts of things. If we did a community, there would obviously be some rules in effect. But everything that people say that enjoy tiny homes is that they just love the lifestyle. It forces them not to be in, forces them to be out, doing stuff. And we have a town that you could be doing plenty of things outside. People I've spoken to, they're like, we just love a little house with just a tiny bit of grass. Be able to ride your bike up to it. You don't have people up below. You don't have ski boots and people clunking up and down stairs. They just want a little slice of their paradise. And so I think the tiny home really does fit into that. They're kind of cute and small. So just a little bit about the general small movement. I mean, I'm involved in some of the bigger houses. Back in 6 and 7, people were doing $7,000, $8,000 ridiculous, 6,000 to 7,000 square foot houses, 10,000. They're just not doing them now. They're doing 2,500 square foot specs, 4,000 square foot. Things far more sensible. The whole movement of people is smaller, is better, efficient, environmental, low utilities, and it kind of trickles down, right down to the small, tiny house movement. There's a lot of segments, but from what I've been listening to, there's baby boomers, the kids have moved out, and they just want to use some of the equity of their house. They don't want to have a $700,000 house. They want to have a $200,000 house to be able to travel and have a good time and use their dollars. And then there's millennials who just love, they're working from the internet, they're doing all sorts of things, they don't need much space, they just want a nice spot to go to. There's a mixture of people amongst that, but there's plenty of people that would really enjoy a tiny house. So this Routt Tiny Home Company that has retained me, they just want to learn about the county, mostly about the city, because that's really where the demand is. But the two really do have a bit of an interplay, but I'll speak a little bit more. The sort of advice that I've given them.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yeah, the advice after the research was done, I'm going to share you a really blocked, just 1 + 1 = 2 way. It's not something that you can just go ahead and do. It needs a very special circumstance to put together the tiny homes. And the houses that they build, this is the trailer type houses, but they also come on ready for foundation, and that's more from the focus that I'm going to talk about. Just because it's real estate, it's not a piece of personal property that gets shipped in and out. And I'm a big believer in home ownership. That's why I do real estate. Home ownership has obviously done some amazing things for people in the good times, and over the long term, it generally does good stuff. We've had some bad times since 2000.
One question. Are there tiny villages where people with tiny homes can go and have a little, like a village?
Well, I mean, at the moment, that's the KOA, I mean, realistically, that's where they can go, because they can plug in, and they can get the sewer. And so, that's one solution. We could build a whole bunch more of that. And Tyler can speak to that subject. But realistically, I'm from a real estate point of view, so I would like to see people have a piece of ground they own, and they can pay it off with 30-year Freddie Mac interest, super low, they can build equity, and so that's the perspective I'm coming from tonight. So the current market reality, prices are going up at least 10% a year, at least in single family, and that's happened for at least 3 or 4 years. Rents, it's easy to say 10 to 15%. We have 1-bedroom condos only 4 years back, $850. Can't find one other less than $1,300 plus now. And when I show you this equation of really where a tiny home fit and really compare to that, you're going to really say this is a really interesting opportunity. Lots in town, there's really only 2 lots under $200,000. And the one lot is in Silver Spur for $179. it has covenants. Okay, so you can't build a tiny house. And it still wouldn't make financial sense. There's 30 lots under 300, and only 2 don't have covenants. So that's not the solution. You can't just go and find a lot, put a tiny house on it. It doesn't make sense. There's one single family under $450,000 at the moment in Steamboat 2, and that needs a bunch of work to it, and that's the starting price. So we'll get some perspective as we move forward here. So really easy math. Okay, we're in school. 250 for a lot plus 100 for a tiny house equals 350. Okay, that's not an economical solution. Assuming that's the midpoint of a lot price. That 100,000 might include, your sewer water requirements. You've still got to put a little driveway in, apartment fees, all the things that have to be done. So that doesn't make sense. So then you look at, okay, maybe you can go and buy one of those lots that's available. You can build, there's 3-acre lots that are multi-family and all sorts of different zoning, complicated zoning opportunities, up to $4 million lots. And they're all designed for airspace conversion. So they're made for condominiums, and Tyler and the city council could see to maybe approving, but then doesn't really make financial sense. These guys want to sell it for the most they can to someone who's going to do it vertical. So even places that you can buy on the open market, they don't make sense either. It's on a price per unit after all your infrastructure, no go. So how can we make it work? That's probably a fair question. And I'm going to share with you this Routt tiny home example they did in Salida, that they really did make it work. And it's definitely out of the box. It's definitely not the standard planning, city council stuff. It has to be very progressive. And it really does, the answer does sit with a combination of the city council, the planning department, and develop a combination, because you need to find a lot that's either zone industrial, it's annexed in, it's something that you can divide a number out and turn it into 30,000 a unit or whatever that amount is to make sense to the equation. You have to kind of invent it. And that's the magic wand that the city council and planning can just go bling. Not so easy, I'm sure. And one thing, Tyler sent me a whole bunch of information about all the different lots and the zoning rules. And look at the map, you go, it's tough. I mean, it's been set in stone that these areas are multi-family, RM1, RM2, there's this many square foot houses, and then you can't just say next to someone who's built a house there, you can suddenly put 400 houses in one little spot. So it's sensitive, but it does need a lot of proactivity. So one of the biggest challenges as well from the developer side is that it's not a free ride. It's not like, hey, let's go put some houses here, let's handshake. You've got to do all your normal entitlement process, which is expensive. Engineering, you've got to prove to them it could be wetlands, it could be this, there's all sorts of process that you have to show why this can work on this lot. $20,000, $50,000, $200,000 later to get voted no. And so you look from the developer point of view, there's not really a lot of incentive to say, hey, how about this one? Because, well, get the process, fill the applications, start paying all your consultants. It's not very easy. So, they have planning department, you might correct me later, but there's a CDP process, which is a conceptual development plan. Is that, you can talk more. I won't speak into it, but they have really been far more visionary than previous planning departments, and they're now putting short processes in that are going to help us. And you can ask Tyler more about those questions. And we're kind of on the cusp of getting there. But the bottom line is supply and demand is the fundamental. We need to create some supply. That we need to make it happen. So here's an example of a tiny community in Salida, done by the Routt Tiny Homes. The big question is like, where are you going to store everything? What are you going to do here? So they have a whole bunch of storage units that they're very small, postage stamp little lots. But how do they do it? What they did is that the city went to the county and worked with the developer and said, look, you've got this 35 acres here. Can we just have that bit in place? How about we give you a nominal amount for it, and will change it to high density, tiny house community. Right. And they've created this right along the river, and it's approved, it's all getting worked on right now, ready to go into infrastructure. But it's an example of what can happen, and it needs people not just with a vision, but making an absolute question.
What differentiates tiny house community from a trailer park?
That's an awesome question.
What was the question?
What differentiates tiny house from a trailer park?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so trailer parks almost always have the land owned by the landlord,
Oh, yes.
and they rent out spaces. And then, so do you think there's any care about, because they never own a piece of land? There's no incentive for them to have any upkeep. They can just go and find a trailer from Utah, plop it down, and then I've got myself a house, hook it up. We're talking about quality, neighborhoods, aesthetically pretty, and things that really fit in with the community. You know, that's one of the biggest challenges. We want to keep our area pretty. We want to create some affordability. That's why I'm a big believer in land ownership versus the leasing of space. These houses, they would own vertically, or they could be rental as well, but it's going to be run by a company that owns both space, not just who cares as long as they pay the rent. I don't mind what it looks like. So that's a good question. So here's the biggest thing in talking to some other towns about this is that they're saying that this is going to really help the shortage of workforce. It's going to be an economic driver, because if you talk to people doing business now, they can't find anyone to work for them. It's like, well, yeah, I was $40 an hour, but now I'm 45, and now I'm 48, because everything keeps going up. So for creating supply, creating low-cost living solutions, I really think is a really great way. People will come and live because they can and they can afford, and then there's your workforce. You can create ideas, you can create business. This is an example. It's one of my favorite ones. I think it's very modern. It's not a trailer, is it? And it's not your normal A-frame. It's kind of, in my mind, it's really cool. It could be anything, but this is an example of a small floor plan, living in super modern, high efficiency, low utility bills. Just did a quick equation, and I think this is where it gets exciting. Just say you had a $200,000 tiny house to stay, that's a lot of money still. I mean, really. Okay, but you could buy a wide front-bedroom condo for $200,000 here as well. That has big HOA fees. But you get all the things we talked about. You get your own little slice of heaven. But if you work out on a 4.25, $885 a month, which compared to the $1,300, that's a massive differential of cost of living. And 247 of that goes to you. You own the house, and there's that much equity that you're building every single month. And that's a pretty good thing to keep someone in the community, and they can fix a rate. Maybe add on $100 for taxes and insurance, but they'll be low. With that number there, that's the bit to go, it's worth pursuing, you know, it's a reasonable number. That's, you know, the areas I went through, and this 30-year fixed interest is a real possibility. I've spoken to mortgage brokers. It's all we need to do is sell the first three, and then we've got comparables for the appraisal process with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and local banks will get behind to sell the first 2 or 3. They will do it. And so I'm not worried that that won't happen. And we want to get into that low-cost interest opportunity. So to answer your question, it's not about a trailer park. It's about empowerment and being modern, innovative, and creating housing. We don't have zoning for it right now, but with the collaboration and some focus, we can definitely make it happen. So, thank you.
So Darrin's done his homework, right? That was a great overview. I just wanted to add one thing to your question about trailer homes. In our energy program for Yampa Valley Sustainability Council, we've been doing some efficiency work on weatherization work on low-income homes. And I recently spoke to a person in Dream Island, and she says her rent per month with only trash is $700. So it's not affordable so much to live in a trailer, and then she has very inefficient unit. Trailers usually, have a 2 or 3 inch wall, not a lot of room for insulation in there. So I'm not sure, does Steve have a presentation?
You know, my presentation is tangible, so no.
Okay. Yeah, so he's
Paling in comparison, just getting all my awards and everything.
So, Dusty's the engineering and tech teacher here for 15 years. They've built 7 tiny homes so far, and yes, and so he sells them at the end of the year. He sells them on Craigslist, and 2 of them have gone to Marble, so they're working out in Gunnison County. And he told me that 15 people had approached him about buying that tiny home back behind there.
We've had a ton of interest. My name is Dusty Dike. I know a lot of people. I see a lot of locals in the crowd. I'm sorry for my lack of presentation, but I was serious. I do have a nice bit of little walking at the end that we can go through and check out some things that we've got. You know, I was born and raised in Steamboat. I've been here 42 years. I was a student here. I think Bill Shoe's somewhere here. I don't know how about there. He was in the front row. That was my shop teacher when I was here. So there's obviously some history in the room. And the fact is I am a landowner. I live right up the street from Morgan. I see her tiny house. I live right in front of one of, I think, the cheapest lots that have been sold in Routt County in the last month. And so, you know, I have a lot to do with it, both personally and actually professionally. And so I love Darrin's presentation. I'm not going to critique it, but I think he brought up some good points that can be pointed out, and I hope maybe my questions could be answered by the guys after. So that's kind of as much as what I'm posing as anything. So don't take it personally, but I think it has to be said too at the same time. From a personal perspective, we build them, and we have a ton of problems placing them. It really is a hard thing to truly place. What is a tiny house when it came up? Well, are you going to move it? Are you going to drive it? Are you trying to drive it from place to place? Because then you better build it light and build it like a camper, because it's not practical. Is ours tiny? Well, sure. Is it light? No. Okay, end of conversation. Is there a better way to build? Yeah, I mean, a SIP panel, something like that, a light engineered styrofoam structurally insulated panel. With pre-thought and engineering, you know, building it indoors, doing it in a manufactured process is the way to go. But the hardest thing is placing. If you want to see, like the one Darrin was just showing, that's beautiful. That's very reminiscent of what we chose to build. But it is not a practically, you don't want to hook it up to your car and drive it from place to place. That's just not practical. The decks, the porches, the other things, the accoutrements that go with it to make it practical. And so I think it is tough to make it real. It's a tough thing to make versus a trailer park. It's an ownership thing. I personally came back as a teacher and had to live in Copper Mountain Estates, which I bought one and fixed up. Those are selling for $121 grand. That's where you don't own the land, but you own the trailer. And the lot rent is, $600 a month. So there's your grand total. Do the math on your own. I don't know how it is. But that's about what you come in at. And you know, it's up in the air. It doesn't have wheels under it. Mom's asking that. You know, there's no wheels under it, but it has a foundation. You got grass. You got some pride and ownership, as Darrin put it. But you don't own the land. Plain and simple. I moved absolutely across about 500, I don't know, a couple hundred yards, and I paid $400,000+ at the foreclosure auction for a home that is, very reminiscent of what you said, 2,500 square feet. And that's what people are building. You do the math. The one they're wanting to build behind me, they're already advertising. It's online for $700,000. I think they're overbuilding for a lot. I'm the neighbor, sure, but like you said, it's a mathematical formula. They are trying to make the most of the money possible. Now, when you look at the lot from a perspective of Megan and I were like, really? Like, is that practical? Is that necessary? Is that what the city envisioned when we talk about historical vision? Is that what they talked about with Fairview lots? They were originally sold to miners for $5,000 in 1972. You had to buy 2 to get enough to build. 0.22 acres is a buildable lot. That's what you can build on. Anything else, you know, I don't remember what the exact fraction is in each neighborhood, but anything else has to have easements or variances or whatever you want to go about. And we've had those. Steamboat Point. Megan and I were in school when they brought in Steamboat Point. What do we call them? The monopoly houses, right? Because they came on a trailer, and we literally watched them crane them up and put them in, and I was like, oh, you know, I should buy Baltic right now. I should have bought Baltic, right? We all should have bought Baltic. They're going for mad money, seriously. But they made provisions and they had foresight, and it worked. Harms Court, right up the way. Okay, we saw it happen. Anybody who knows Harms, now what you're seeing is bigger homes, maximizing the square footage, trying to do the best they can, and even some of those people that built those almost lost them. You know, Christopher, you know those guys. I mean, they put their heart into it, whether it was the economy or whatever you want to say. It's a tough sell. It's a tough sell. And so it really does take vision. My parents have owned the Burger Express lot since early '72. You guys remember getting a Burger Express burger? In general, that's what it's going to take. Somebody coming in, but throwing down some money. It's going to take money. There is money involved. But the vision and the end goal is really cool. I think it's worth it. When we've had trouble placing, marble has vision. They're all over marble, but they're kind of small. 10 by 12 is what the city allows as a shed. So a lot of people do a 2-story tall one, and that's the way it works. If you notice I'm shaking, I have Parkinson's, so I don't get those.
How do you decide what to sell your tiny house of the year for?
Oh, that's a great question. Whatever we can get.
And what have some of them gone for?
Not very much, not as much as we'd like to. Only because the goal is not to make money by us. We're not in that business. That's not us. We want it to go to the best home. The Paivas, Miss Paiva, if you guys had Miss Paiva in 5th or 7th or 8th grade, you've had your kids with, that's who's getting ours. Matt Paiva owns Brightside Solar. He's a local family. She's a school teacher. They bought it to place in town. Their use is as a man cave / mother-in-law close to their house. I think it's a great use. I think that's the use we need to see, which does require some vision by the HOAs and the covenants of our neighborhood. Fairview's great because we don't have covenants. That can suck for some people if your neighbor's not the one you like, right? So it's both ways. It's a tough equation. Now that comes down to the camper thing. We built ours out of a 5th wheel. Why? Because we bought it for $200 on the side of the road. Gary Wall, I ran it into something, apparently that's how we got it, and we destroyed it, and we used the trailer. And it was awesome. It was the perfect scenario. We got all the parts, we recycled everything, the kids had a great time in it, and in the long run we got a flatbed trailer to frame up from the beginning. And we got all the accoutrements that came originally with it. You can find them on sites like Gold Park, where somebody's ran into it while it's taking a corner, and the insurance company totaled it. And you get it for pennies on the dollar. Okay, so if you want to buy one, you're going to wreck or remodel or repurpose, that's my suggestion. Go to a site like that or find one that's wrecked. I don't care if it's a camper. I even, like I was mentioning to, we take the vision of 10 by 12. I'd love to hear their take on the real 10 by 12. We're all allowed to build a 120 square foot structure without a permit, is what I am informed. Now, how tall? What can you do with that? What are its uses? That's up for a lot of interpretation. But to maximize it would be everyone's goal. And from that, we've had people ask us, can we put a pop-up camper on it? Can we do this? You might have a 5th wheel. You might have seen one. They come on 5th wheels. You can get a 5th wheel that has a pop-up camper above it. Like literally, they make all kinds of things. So, I mean, they make, we can make a tiny house that its footprint is small, but when it gets there, it goes, and everything falls down. Like, that's the idea, to maximize what you're trying to do. But the impression is, you have to know where it's going, what it's doing. There's a ton of resources. You go out to the Milner Mall, there's a ton of stuff. Our builders, our locals are very philanthropic, very willing to give. A 3-foot 2x4 is everywhere. You can build a geodesic dome out of a 3-foot 2x4. Okay? You know what I'm talking about. Buckminster Fuller's strongest structure on the planet. Okay? It's ridiculous. 3-foot 2x4 in a triangle. He can build a structurally insulated panel that we can construct in minutes. It's an igloo cooler. It's too tight. We got to have an air exchange unit because you can heat it with a candle and body heat. But you smell bacon and all those other nasty smells for days. So you got to make sure you air it out. But I mean, literally, it goes together that simple. I mean, so it's that easy if we have the right sites. And so there could be standards involved at the time of what you do and what you do with your land. As far as Steamboat goes, I think the ones that I think of right now, there's like modular versus, trailer. Really, that's where it comes down to, what is one versus the other. There are some really beautiful modulars, and you can really make a modular beautiful, but then you start to increase the price. And unfortunately, land costs in Steamboat. I'm a teacher, I'm a landowner, I'm a parent, I have a kid. I do argue with the numbers a little. I think 350 is okay for us to come in at. I think there's a little bit of an unrealistic expectation to have too affordable of a house. Because I understand that it takes some work, it takes some effort. This is not an easy place to live and be. And so with that, whether you're a settler or you're here today, it takes some effort. So you don't just get it handed to you. And so I think that the number has to be realistic because we're already expecting someone to pay $120 grand, not own the land, and come up with $600 plus more dollars. Okay? And so it has to be something affordable. But 350, when Darrin came out and said it's not a solution, it's not far off. It's not far off. If you can group some costs, get some things loaded, I think do that. I think it's possible. It's realistic. When we come out and tour ours, the ones we've done ones that go together, ones that are dropped off with a crane, ones that are one-story sheds that are like I said, like the Go-Go Gadget version, open and closed so bears and people don't get in. This one is probably the biggest one. The money thing, we've never really made more than maybe 20%. The kids have an incredible time doing it. They love every bit of it. They do it all. So yeah, there's flaws. I mean, our motto has always been, we do it right because we do it twice. That's pretty much what happens. So it is a 2-step forward, 3 steps back. We have an Airstream out there right now. We have a 2-story greenhouse. We're building a theater platform, so all of you can come and LARP and dance and play on our platform. And then we have a lot of things. The greenhouse has gone to the Montessori school, which is taking over Christian Heritage. They bought one that we did as a kit, and we chose to build a better one that was stronger and tighter. You may have seen the teardrop ones. There's a lot of ones around. We didn't really have a great, a kid drew it. It's like I said, it's imperfect, but it's a work in progress. We've had a lot of input from people, so we get a lot of input. I got to tell you from a personal standpoint, I've got a lot of criticism as well, because it looks like a construction site. It is not a perfect model. And so, with that said, it takes a little bit of understanding both as a community and as everyone. It's just, it is what it is. But any questions, anybody else? Yeah.
Would it ever be possible to, how many, to take 2 or 4 houses and put them on a standard lot, but connect them with maybe an overhead something, and so you call it a duplex, or you call it a condo?
These guys would know the best. They know the best examples. I could speak from a little experience. I mean, there's some great ones around. The little one right over, right as you drop into the elementary school is a cool one. There are some, even the one up 9th Street. A lot of you don't know, right behind Creekside, there's a little apartment that hangs right over the little hill. It's got like 4 little apartments on it. If you've ever been fortunate enough to live there, it's a cool little thing. And then even the apartments that sit behind Old Town Pub. I almost was able to buy that one year. I mean, those are a rare example of a downtown apartment that was, I think, condominiumized a few years ago where you could own it.
But they have walls that touch, right?
Yes, quite common connection. Yeah.
Separate.
Yeah, once again, I think
Just to get by the
Steamboat Point would probably be the best example of close proximity owner of that. Anybody else got a good example? Kroger, you've been here forever.
Aren't there some behind the church? There's like little cabins. They are like the original tiny homes.
Right behind the Emerald Mountain School?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know the ones you're talking about, the Heavenly.
Yeah, the Episcopal Church or something.
Heaven. That's all I remember. You guys remember the church?
They're tiny.
They're tiny. They're very tiny. Very tiny.
Tiny homes. No, but they're.
But he calls them cozy.
Them, but
He calls them cozy. I don't know. I know that those are coveted. Those are coveted houses. I know Eric Feely bought one a couple of years ago. I know I've seen them come and go, but those are coveted as well. And what we're seeing is really people placing them as mother-in-laws. They are around, though. I won't speak like, you drive up Burgess Creek, remember where John Caribou used to live? There's one on the side. There's some little tiny places placed all over town that people have lived in over time. And so, we deem it 300 or less. I think Megan's doing a great job leading by example. I think 600 qualifies. In Europe, 1,000. There is families in 1,000 or less. That's kind of the number. That's where I guess it makes mathematical sense.
So next we have Tyler Gibbs. He has been the Director of Planning and Community Development for the City of Steamboat for 6 years, and he's also a licensed architect. Before working for the city, he spent 18 years with the City of Denver serving the positions of Urban Design Director and Planning Services Manager. Prior to working in the public sector, he spent 13 years in private practice in architecture and urban design, including being a founding principal in the firm City Design in San Diego.
Thank you. So I'm going to touch on some of the regulatory aspects of tiny homes. This presentation was originally put together. There were 3 of us involved, actually. Let's see, the page down at the top. Okay, page down. All right. So this was originally put together for the American Planning Association conference, state conference that was made in Steamboat last October, that has also been given to Rocky Mountain Land Use Institute down at DU back in March. But there were 3 of us involved. I want to give them credit. Don Elliott, who's a planner and attorney who works all over the country, and Brent Pearson, locally here with Resort Ventures West, who's been involved with Wild Horse, but has also been involved with trying to get a tiny home community off the ground over in Grant County, and has looked at opportunities here as well. There's a lot of slides here. I'm going to try and move through them pretty quickly. So just kind of started out with something I think we've already got a pretty good idea of. What are they? The answer that Don thought he wanted to focus on was the ones that we see on wheels, the ones that are mobile. I would actually probably say any of these things could be a tiny house. But there are some very important distinctions in how you approach it between whether this is something on wheels, particularly has already been touched on a little bit, whether you intend to continue to be able to move it around like an RV. That becomes a very different type of structure than if you're planning to build something small, even if it perhaps comes in on wheels, but it's going to be on a foundation and ultimately be essentially like a home on a lot that's going to stay there for a while. So again, some start as RVs and become homes. Some evolve into or even start as fixed homes. So I think it was in Darrin's slides as well, that one there on your left that starts out as something that can come in on wheels, and then the chassis dropped onto a foundation. It becomes essentially a permanent home. It could be picked up again, but that's not necessarily the intention. Some of them, like this one on the right, were built for a specific site. So how are they regulated? Again, you got to know what your intention is. Is this something that you intend to move, or is this something that's going to stay fixed? So you've got to understand the building code, and it's a different code, as I said, if it's something that's going to be out on the highway as opposed to something that's going to sit on a lot. Ben can address that from the building department standpoint. So again, if it's designed for human occupancy, it has to meet. If it's going to sit on a lot, be a permanent structure, it has to meet local building codes. If it's something that's going to be essentially like a manufactured home, particularly one that might be moved again, then it meets a different set of standards, HUD standards for manufactured homes. So again, you have to figure out what building code, what building standards does it have to meet, and you also have to understand local health codes. How many square feet per person? How many people are going to live in this thing? And sort of what are the minimums for that the local jurisdiction defines as a livable unit or home for a person, for a couple, for a family, and so forth. So that has to do with the number of sinks and bathrooms and sleeping rooms and that sort of thing.
Do you have those numbers?
I don't have all those as part of the presentation, and because it can get a little complicated depending on how you're asking the question. The answers are going to vary a little bit. But I know both Ben is prepared to answer questions like that from a building code standpoint. I'm more prepared to answer them from a zoning standpoint. So again, if it's going to be on the road, it's going to be meeting standards that have to do with, well, is this a safe thing to have out on the highway and towing at 60 miles an hour? Transient occupancy. This is another aspect of whether it's on wheels or not. If this is built like an RV and you're just going to pull it into your backyard, then it may be considered by city zoning essentially camping. It's not a home, it's not a secondary unit, it's a camper. It just happens to be parked in your backyard. So the city's going to look at it as just as if you rolled in with your Winnebago or whatever it might be, your pop-up, and you were camping in the backyard. That's not illegal, but it has limits on how long you can do that. On the other hand, if you were pulling one of these tiny homes in, setting it on a foundation, hooking it up to utilities, then it could become a secondary unit, which is legal under the city's zoning. So some people refer to those secondary unit, a mother-in-law unit, a place for your teenager to get, you know, transitioned out to for a while. Those are perfectly legal, but again, you got to know the distinction between that. If it's still sitting there on wheels and just plugged in with an extension cord, it's a camper. So again, kind of been all over this. If it's recognized for long-term occupancy, it's going to be either a permanent structure like a secondary unit, or it could fall under essentially something more like a mobile home, which has, and again, they have their own set of regulations, which are federal standards for how those are built. Zoning regulations. So now we get into the things that the city governs. What can be built, where can it be built, what densities, and so forth. So, as you're probably aware, zoning determines what use you can make of the land, what type of structures can be built there. The whole city is zoned, and if you've ever seen a city zoning map, there's different zones mapped all over the city with different minimum lot sizes, different types of uses. As you know, there's commercial zones, there's different type of residential zones. There's residential zones for big houses on big lots, and we have residential zones for smaller houses on smaller lots. We've even got some zones that allow for some pretty small lots that were developed when Steamboat 700 was proposed, but they've never actually been mapped anywhere yet. What we have not done in the city of Steamboat is actually identify any pieces of ground and say, we're going to zone this just for tiny houses. Because at this point, even though we've had some people come and speak to us about the possibility of creating a tiny house neighborhood, and they're looking at a specific piece of land, and we said, we'd be happy to zone it for tiny houses if that is in fact the direction you want to go. It's just not zoned for that yet, and we think it's a little too soon to try and proactively zone somebody's land and say, hey, all you can build here is tiny houses. We've got to wait and know if there's somebody out there who really thinks this is going to be a viable project, and then we're ready to work with it. So again, does it meet the building code, or is it manufactured for long-term resident? Is it permitted as a primary residence? In the city of Steamboat, we don't have a minimum house size in our zoning code, so there's nothing in our zoning code that prohibits you from building a tiny house as your primary home. Now, a lot of the neighborhoods, as has been mentioned, might have covenants. So a lot of the subdivisions in town have covenants that say that we don't want any houses in our neighborhood that are less than a certain size. So that doesn't have anything to do with the city. The city is not involved in covenants, and we can't change covenants. Those are homeowners associations that create covenants. So that's something you would have to look into if you were looking at a piece of ground. If it's part of a neighborhood that has covenants, that's something the city wouldn't be able to help you with. So, you know, again, would it be allowed as an accessory dwelling unit? Well, every zone district in the city of Steamboat Springs allows accessory dwelling units. Some neighborhood covenants don't, but the city says that's fine. You can build an accessory dwelling unit on your property with your primary home in any neighborhood in the city. And we've got a lot of them. And in many cases, it's not only a great option for the person who might want to rent that secondary unit, but a great option for the owner of the property to get a little additional income that might help with their mortgage. So we think they're a great opportunity. Again, not every neighborhood wants them. I was involved with rewriting the Denver zoning code just before moving up here, and we made it an option in every neighborhood in Denver. Some neighborhoods opted in, some opted out. It was really a political decision, neighborhood by neighborhood. But Denver thought it was a great idea. Steamboat thinks it's a great idea, and we're all for trying to make it happen for anybody who is interested in that. Subdivision regulations. So subdivision, if it isn't a neighborhood that already has platted lots, or maybe it's an area where a piece of ground was platted as a much larger lot, you have to go through the process of creating lots. And we have been talking to a couple people in town who are interested in possibly looking at subdividing a larger piece of ground for tiny homes. But that's just a process we're going to have to go through. And we've looked at it a couple of different ways. We had conversations about, well, do you want to do a bunch of individual lots and you plop a tiny house down in the middle of each one? not necessarily a real efficient use of the land. We've talked about, well, maybe it could be zero lot line, so you can get more of that lot to be usable rather than having just a little bit down each side. Or you can actually look at condominium, a condominium approach where the land is in common ownership and the homes are condominiumized so that you can, again, be more efficient with the way you use the land, and your own tiny home owners association can be responsible for maintaining the land. But it's a way, when you're trying to get the most use out of the land, when you put in these small units on it, you can be more efficient perhaps that way. Probably the least efficient is trying to do a bunch of individual lots and have to deal with setbacks and all the sort of things you have to do with one lot at a time if you're just trying to put a tiny house on it. So again, it has to meet the building code, it has to meet the zoning code, it has to fit into a subdivision that's been created to allow it. So just again, these are the questions you have to ask. You've got a platted lot, you've got the zoning. There's a process to go through, particularly if you're going to be out in the county or something where you need to know where your utilities coming from and that sort of thing. Again, in the city, you have to have a platted lot. In the county, there may be different regulations, but again, the county, as we're aware, typically doesn't zone for small lots. It's large pieces of land. So you may, if you want to, as was suggested, have a tiny house, move it out of town, and really feel like you've got that independence. Maybe the county is the way to go, and Ben knows more about not only the county building code, but the zoning code and what's allowed, and the county can address that as well. So again, size matters, the size of the house, the size of not only just for building code, but for health and occupancy code, and for zoning, as well as for subdivision regulations. Can you create a community of tiny houses? You had that question earlier. Absolutely. In fact, that's we have at least folks who are coming to the city who are interested in talking about this. That's what they're talking about generally, about creating a community of tiny homes rather than one-off. And I think there's a lot of potential in that. Everybody who's come to talk to us, we've been very encouraging so far. We just haven't had anybody quite ready to say, yeah, I think this is going to work, I'm ready to pull the trigger. But we've got folks who are definitely looking into it at a variety of different scales, you know, from maybe a dozen to 50 or more. So I'm going to skip through some of these, some examples of tiny house communities. You saw one in Salida. Not quite sure where this was, but this is kind of a good example of showing how houses might be clustered with possibly some common space. That larger building is probably a common, maybe some common space that can be shared, whether it's garages or whether there's a common social area or whatever. Might verge more on the concept of co-housing. So, again, there's a lot of decisions to be made. You might be looking at co-housing, particularly if you're trying to do a tight multi-unit development. You want to make sure everybody's going to get along, probably establish some rules up front about how everybody works together. You know, there's everything. It was mentioned, Darrin mentioned earlier that currently the only community, if you will, in the city that would allow this is the KOA. So campgrounds are one version, and we know in some parts of the country people will come in and create a community there on a seasonal basis, particularly in the campgrounds. But that's one option. Single-family lots. Cottage Neighborhoods is another. There's a great book on cottage neighborhoods. It's really been something that's been pioneered a lot in the Northwest, in Washington and Oregon. If you're familiar with the old bungalow courts that were popular in a lot of communities around the country in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, a bunch of little cottages around a little common yard. That idea is kind of coming back. I mean, those were the tiny houses of their day, and were very efficient. Probably a lot of them the same sizes we're talking about now. The Stapleton development down in Denver has experimented with the bungalow court idea. Not quite as small as they were back in the 30s and 40s, but kind of moving in that direction to say, again, you might take a lot that would have been maybe originally the size that you would put a single-family home on and get half a dozen cottages with a common yard space, which is really a wonderful way to live for families as well, because you've got that sort of common space for the kids, for a community garden, for whatever it might be. So again, that's a concept we see coming back and seems to make a lot of sense. And those really fit in traditional neighborhoods as well. There was a time when a lot of the neighborhoods in Denver still had little bungalow court pockets mixed right in with the single-family houses, because that was just the way they were built back in the 20s and 30s. There are some websites you can go. I'm sure a lot of you have been to them. This particular graphic touting some of the benefits of tiny houses comes from a website called thetinylife.com. Some other good ones that I've come across were livingbiginatinyhouse.com. Fresh Home has a tiny house section. And I mentioned cottages. This one, this lower one, is a great example of the bungalow court. The Katrina Cottages that were developed as a response to Hurricane Katrina, first deployed in some of the Gulf areas that were hit by the hurricane, but have proven to have a life beyond that, beyond temporary sort of emergency housing, particularly as they've developed a little more style. They're not just the FEMA trailers that used to be hauled in, but actually, you know, something that's got some style. People say, hey, this could be home forever. Tiny house manufacturers, Routt was already mentioned. That's a local Colorado company. And they've done a neighborhood down in Walsenburg as well as Salida. There's a company called Wheelhouse out of the Jackson Hole area that makes some pretty interesting models. Again, a lot of these, somebody talked to, you asked about joining some together. This is one that it's not really tiny anymore, but it was made of tiny components, I guess.
But 3 families could live.
Potentially.
That's what I was thinking, but you buy
Potentially, or it could be something that would grow over time.
and you fit into a neighborhood. And
As a family grew, or as you brought aging parents back to live with you or whatever, you could potentially add another tiny module. Now, I want to touch real quickly on something that isn't exactly tiny house. This is the multifamily version of tiny house called micro units. And these have become very popular in a lot of larger cities. They're starting to be built in Denver. They've been successful in Seattle, Portland, Boston, Philadelphia. And essentially where these are successful is in high-cost, high-amenity locations. In a lot of cities where you find folks who want to be in that great hip neighborhood that's got the coffee shop around the corner, the shared workspace and that sort of thing. But I also think if you just look at those criteria, high cost, high amenity, it's exactly what we are as well. So the opportunity for possibly looking at the multifamily version of tiny houses, I think, is also another opportunity here. It seems like the sweet spot for these is around 400 square feet. They're very popular with younger folks, singles, young professionals. The reason that they're able to build these at where the rent per square foot is less than what is typical in the market is though even though these are fairly expensive to build because you're building more kitchens, more bathrooms, they are small. They're 400 square feet or less. So the net rent, even though they may be getting a rent that's a higher per square foot than the 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom down the street, you can get into it for less rent per month. And that's still a profitable venture for the builder. So it's an interesting option with the tiny houses or with these tiny units. Just like the challenge that comes up most frequently when we discuss these in a place like Steamboat is, where am I going to keep my toys? Right? You're not going to bring your canoe and your skis and your bike and all the other things that we like to have into 400 square feet more than likely. So we're getting short on time. Yeah, so I'll go through this quickly. But we've seen these, like I said, in a lot of larger cities. So from large buildings, actually the one below was the old hotel next to Mile High Stadium, which just converted to micro units.
About how big is 400 square feet, like where we're sitting here?
Oh gosh.
40 foot story, 40 by 20.
Kind of this front area maybe.
Oh, okay.
4 by 10. A little bigger than a sheet
That's
of
40.
plywood.
So again, high amenity areas, so great for a location like downtown or near the mountain, but most of us don't move here to spend our time sitting in our apartment. We're here to enjoy everything that Steamboat's got. So again, it might be a great opportunity. I'll just again mention that these have been very successful in some larger cities, but a lot of resort communities are starting to look at them.
That last one?
What's that?
The high ceiling ones, they're all micro units?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that they found are very successful, makes the space high, big windows, lots of light, so it doesn't feel so tight, even though the walls are close, the ceiling's high. Maybe you start to see a lot of bikes and kayaks hung from that ceiling. They did a competition in Denver a couple of years ago. These were some of the winning entries for a site in the River North area on the Platte River north of downtown. There is great reference on micro units put out by Urban Land Institute, and you can download it online. So just go to Urban Land Institute, micro units if you're interested in those. And there's a whole great publication that describes everything from the economics of developing them to the demographics of who's interested in them. And I think this is also a product that we're likely to see proposed here in Steamboat in the near future. So I think our housing issues, and had this conversation with Gates earlier this morning, solving our housing issues isn't going to be one thing. It's not one solution. It's going to be a lot of things. So micro units, tiny houses, co-housing, you name it. I think we've got to be able to look at a whole variety of things ultimately. So that's it for me.
Okay, we'll just introduce Alan. He's going to talk from the county's perspective. He's been a planner, too, with the Routt County Planning Department for the past 4 years, and previous to that, he was a member of the Routt County Planning Commission for 2.5 years. He earned a degree in landscape architecture from Louisiana State University.
So I'm going to keep my comments pretty short, and I'm going to speak specifically to the regulations that are found in if you were to do something out in the county. The county treats tiny homes just like any other size home. There's no special consideration given. There's no minimum size for homes out in the county. They are allowed in all the residential zone districts and the agriculture forestry zone districts, and those zone districts make up 98% of the county. And you can put them on there as long as you meet the water and wastewater standards that are found. We do allow secondary dwelling units on lots that are at least 35 acres that already have an existing residence on them. And these are generally limited to 800 square feet. Depending on the size of parcel that you have, they can be detached, but if you have less than 50 acres, in between 35 and 50, they must be attached to the primary residence. So if it's on wheels or a trailer, then it's considered an RV, and we consider it camping, just like Tyler had mentioned earlier. And camping is only allowed in the agriculture forestry zone district for up to 60 days as a use by right, which means no permit is required. And then on legally created lots in the agriculture forestry zone district, you can camp up to 180 days on your parcel, but you do need a permit through the county, and It's a easy permit to obtain. And the main thing that we're looking for when it comes to that is that you're taking care of your wastewater appropriately. And that permit can be obtained once per year per parcel. So you can't get a permit for 180 days and then turn around and get a permit back to back so that you can live on it full time. Yeah?
Do you mind elaborating on the sphere of that lot? Like, what's it for?
What do you mean?
Well, it doesn't seem like it serves much of a purpose. If you're out in the middle of nowhere on a 35-acre parcel, why does it matter if you stay longer than 60 or 180 days in something with wheels on it?
Because then we would consider that living and not camping.
And that's not okay because of which concerns?
Because of the wastewater concern. We want to make sure that you're taking care of your effluent properly and not contaminating the environment, basically. And so camping, like I said, is only allowed in the agriculture forestry zone district. It's not allowed in any of the residential zone districts. So if you're looking at that stagecoach lot that's $5,000, that is a residentially zoned piece of property, and camping is not allowed on that through county regulations and through the covenants that are found in Stagecoach. Steamboat Lake is in a similar situation where those are zoned residential and camping is not allowed. So the county does have a process for tiny homes or subdivisions. It's either through the subdivision process or through the planned unit development process. But not to give you too much hope, there are some major hurdles when it comes to subdivisions or planned unit developments in the county, because the master plan, which guides development in the county created by the community, says that those kinds of residential developments should be in or near the growth centers. So Steamboat, Oak Creek, Yampa, Hayden, and the Stagecoach area. And that's what I've got.
Thank you.
Hey, I've learned that Ben is kind of a quiet guy, so he
Well,
may get...
I've made some notes, and I want to talk.
He's a county building official since fall of 2014. He's International Code Council Master Code Professional and holds 23 ICC certifications. He first came here to Routt County in 1984 when he spent 10 weeks helping his brother build a barn. He's also a master plumber, and he's been active in building, remodeling, plumbing, mechanical, and he has a lot of background, but we'll just let him jump in and...
Okay. All right. So my master plumber's license is in Pennsylvania, so not valid here in Colorado. 5 things I want to talk about. First of all, this happens to be May, Building Safety Month. So I want to remind everybody, while I have this opportunity, when you go home, check your smoke detectors and your CO detectors. Push the button, hurt your ears. Save your life. Remember, smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, have a life expectancy of around 10 years. Check your warranty. A lot of the sites, you go on to take your carbon monoxide detector, go on a website, you put in the serial number, and they'll tell you whether it's good or not. If it's past its life expectancy, buy a new one, because they will save your lives. Second thing we'll talk about, smoke detectors, inspect your cords, lamp cords, any kind of extension cord, any cord you plug in, check it, look for frays, see if it's, any of the insulation is cracked, discard it. They start fires. It's called an arc fault. It'll arc either inside or something, or the 2 wires, and it'll cause a fire. I know this for a fact, so trust me on it. Call me if you have more questions. I can explain it better in depth. Fire extinguishers. If you don't have one, buy one. If you have one, check the date. Maybe have it tested. If it's old, just recycle it and buy a new one. Second thing I want to talk to you about is a couple years ago I went to a nutritionist, and that's really not the point of all this, but But in the interview process, she said, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I'm a building inspector. And her reply was kind of, you know, oh, you're the people we hate. And then she went, oh, I'm sorry. And I went, no, that's okay. Let me ask you a question. I said, did you and your family do you go to the local shopping malls? She went, well, yeah. So when you get out of your car and start to walk towards the building, do you start to get nervous or shake, or you worry about things? And it's looking at me like I've got 3 heads, and I go, not 2, but 3. And I said, okay, so you walk inside, or do you pull your children tight? You know, are you looking for the exits, or are you worried the building might collapse or catch fire, or somehow you won't make it out alive? She goes, no, I've got 4 heads. And I said, the reason that you don't worry about it is because of building inspectors, architects, engineers, the plan review process, and generally building inspections and fire departments. That's why you feel safe going in there. The United States of America has a great record of building safety. And it's because, you know, and I'm including Tyler, because as an architect, AIA certified, they didn't mention that, but I know you are. You know, we build good buildings. We focus on this, and so we keep people safe. Not to mention the builders who really do a great job here. I see there might be a couple out here. I don't want to leave them out, you know. But we hold them to a standard, and they cooperate. We have good buildings. So that's the second point. Third point is tiny houses. I don't. This is a little known fact. Nobody touched on this, but I come from my hometown, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. If you don't know it, in 1889 they had a flood that killed 2,200 plus people. A dam broke and it went through the community and pushed the community up against a bridge, and that was it. Some of it caught. It was horrible. Well, the American Red Cross hadn't been established yet, but the government in Washington, D.C. was contacted about it, and so a lot of individual people started bringing aid. Somebody had this idea, we lost all these homes, we need some place to put people. They prefabricated tiny homes, but had wall sections and roof sections, and they transported them in railroad cars and in trucks and any way they could get them there, and they built these structures. And interestingly enough, it was forgotten about until probably about 8 years ago. Somebody was tearing down, they wanted to tear down a building, and they're pulling the siding off, and they came upon this odd structure. They'd never seen anything. They contacted the local historical guy, and he started doing research, and it turns out it was one of these homes that had actually they brought in to put people in temporarily, tiny homes. I mean, they were probably 600-800 square feet. One survived. It's now on display. They've restored it. It's on display there. So that might be the original tiny home. So 1889. The fourth thing, I want to differentiate between zoning and building. You know, Alan does zoning. Tyler does zoning. Zoning is where you can build it and what you're allowed to build. It tells you where, how close to the property line, how high you can make it. Can you build a gas station? Can you build a house? Can you build a hospital? Can you build a school? It tells you where and how close and how high. It limits that. The building code tells you how to build it. We don't care where you build it, you know, as long as it's not too close to another building. We don't really care how high, as long as it meets the building code that limits height and area of buildings. You want to put sprinklers in it, things like that. So that's our shtick. Okay, so we work together, and some of our things kind of cross a little bit. They're connected, but they're separate. So just to bear that in mind. So now, tiny houses. The building department view of tiny homes. There's 4 scenarios. The fourth one has an A and a B. The first scenario, and the one that I embrace, is where a tiny home is site built. You come in with one of these planned tiny home communities, and you buy a lot where there's an agreement to lease a lot long term, and you build that tiny house right there on that location. It has a footing and a foundation, maybe a crawl space or on a slab. For those buildings, we will issue a building permit, we'll do a plan review, We'll do inspections. We'll issue a certificate of occupancy when it's done. And the second scenario that we see is where it's a HUD home. The state of Colorado regulates homes that are built off-site, like manufactured homes, industrialized homes. Those are, you may know by the name of mobile home or trailer, or modular homes. So modular homes are now industrialized homes. Trailers, mobile homes are now manufactured homes. Those are regulated, can only be built in factories. If they're brought to Colorado, those factories have to be approved by the state of Colorado. And there's those buildings are inspected by a third-party inspector on the site, and they have a tag that's recognized throughout the nation for inspectors. So if you are an authorized third-party inspector for a manufactured or industrialized home, you're recognized, your sticker goes in, and that home is then brought in. We can set it, and you're allowed to occupy it legally. The third scenario is where a tiny home could be built on a frame with wheels. It's not HUD approved. The building department, because it's not real estate, building department has nothing to do with it. They're only good for camping. 180 days, that's Alan's. So the fourth scenario,
Not my rule.
well, it's a rule that Alan enforces. So scenario 4A is where it's on a frame and wheels, and it's built here with inspections, and parked somewhere and tied down. We can issue, as long as it's built here and we do the inspections, we issue a permit, and it's tied down to a site, very much like a mobile home. We can issue a certificate of occupancy for those. The fourth scenario is where it's built without inspections, and we can't approve people to live in them. You can't, even a 200 square foot dwelling, if you could somehow sleep standing up, if there's electricity and plumbing in it, and you want to live in there, you want that to be your home, you've got to have inspections, and you have to pass those inspections. So, any questions? Question?
In the event, in that last scenario, that was to happen, and somebody was to build something either on site or on wheels without any inspection, and it's finished, and then somebody wanted to have a mode of recourse once code enforcement gets involved, is there a way to take a step backwards and get it inspected, or is that out of the question?
There can be a process, yes.
And what does that
Yes.
process actually look like?
Well, what the process looks like is we have to, you'd have to submit an application for a permit, you'd have to provide us with plans, and we'd have to evaluate the building to see, as far as the plumbing and the electrical, which, may require that you cut some drywall or paneling out so we can see the wiring. You need to meet the energy code. Now, there is an alternate to the energy code. If there's not enough insulation in there, it's pretty hard to get it in. And there would be a method through which, if you can show that you're using a minimal amount of energy, that we could work out some consideration to approve it with less than the minimum required insulation.
Okay, I imagine that's going to be a frequent phenomenon, right? It's going to happen quite a lot.
Well, maybe. I hope it's, if we're building something today, we're in the coming year, and then you want to come back, within the year or 2 years after it's built, and say, I'd like to get a CO for it now, we're going to say, you build it illegally, tear it down. If you have something that's 15, 20, 30 years old that has no certificate of occupancy, we'll take a look at that. But if you're building something now to live in, you should be getting a building permit.
Will be required to tear it down?
You may very well be, yes. I mean, you may not be able to occupy it. Legally, yes. So, and generally, things are complaint driven. So if we get a complaint about a building that's being, that was recently built and is being occupied illegally, you'll either have to get a certificate of occupancy or, you know, through the court process, you could be required to tear it down if you don't do that. Yes.
So your advice would be, if you were going to try to build a little one on wheels, to go through the building permit process with you as you're doing it?
If you tend to, if it's not for camping, yes. If you want to use it as a permanent, as a dwelling unit,
yeah.
okay. Yeah, I'd suggest you do that. Now, when we look at the wheels, on wheels, we have to be pretty careful. We may need to work with the state a little bit, because generally when something is transportable, they have some jurisdiction over that we may not.
Right. So it's got to meet the RVIA, whatever it is, standard as well as.
Yeah. If you want to build it on wheels to move it somewhere and then drop it off, take the wheels away, I think we can handle that.
But if you want the ability to move it at
continuously,
some point,
okay.
not continuously, but you know, every 180 days.
Well, probably what you should do is, if you want to do something like that, is come and see me, and we'll talk very specifically about what you want to do, and then we'll try to work out something. But there are so many scenarios to run. I don't know if we can talk about them all, but figure out exactly what you want to do and come see me, and we'll try to accommodate people. I mean, we're not trying to stop progress. I mean, I'm very supportive of the tiny home concept, and I, you know, Tyler and I talked, and Alan and I talked earlier about, you know, really what, ideally, we would have a tiny house subdivision. And we talked about some different, really interesting scenarios. I mean, I got more excited about our conversation earlier than I have been. But so, all right, well, thank you. Oh,
one quick question, really quick. How many square feet is it, like, for per person? Is it 50 square feet? Is it 200? Do you have a number? I'm just curious.
The building code doesn't state that.
Okay.
And I don't know if there's anything in zoning, either in the city or the county. The minimum room size for a dwelling is 70 square feet. You've got to have at least one room with 70 square feet. We run into a little bit of issues with the location of plumbing fixtures. I've seen some of the tiny houses where if you want to be on the toilet, you're here. You want to take a shower, you're here. You want to wash your hands, you're here. And the building code doesn't allow them to be that close, but we certainly will be open-minded and make some, you know, we can write some code exceptions for tiny houses. And we're open-minded to do that.
Thanks, everybody. Let's give them a round of applause.